Shabbat Shalom. I hope that everybody had a wonderful Pesach, and everybody did the Haggadah in their own way. One of the truisms of Judaism is that the Haggadah is never quite the same in every house, even if it is the exact same holy Maxwell House edition. Nonetheless, the way it is performed, the way it is carried out is a little different. I am willing to bet that not everybody here did every stanza of Dayenu. Maybe? I'm willing to bet that not everybody here read through every line of the Midrashic interpretation of the My Father Was a Wandering Aramean. Maybe? And I am almost certain that very, very few continued with the paragraph Shfoch Hamarcha. Anybody know that paragraph? Yes. What's it about? Give me the summary.
Well, we asked God to, different translations, common one is pour out your wrath upon our enemies who seek to annihilate us.
Pour out your wrath is the sort of official opening, and I think a good, both literal and correct capturing of the essence of that passage. Pour out your wrath upon the nations that know you not, and that devour your servant Jacob, meaning us. Not a lot of people are comfortable calling for God's wrath upon enemies. It sounds a little harsh. It sounds a little strident. It sounds a little militant. And as a matter of fact, many of us, I think, are equally disturbed by the militant chants of those that oppose us. One of the major problems that has been seen on college campuses over the last few months has been not just the protest in favor of peace, but the chants and the ideas that there should be intifada, that there is no other solution with intifada, of course, meaning violent uprising and murder of the Jewish population of Israel. We are uncomfortable with such chants. When they chant that there should be death to the Zionists, we are uncomfortable with such chants. But it can't be that we are just uncomfortable with such chants, because within our own text, not only within your Haggadah, but even within Acharei and other places, we do call for the destruction of the wicked. So it can't just be calling for destruction that makes us uncomfortable. There has to be another element to it, and the Tan might get us there. Thank you. All right, so first answer is that from most of our psukim, whether it be in the Haggadah, whether it be in the Sidur, or whether elsewhere in the Tanakh, we are appealing to God as a sense of justice, and that God will sort this out of who is in fact worthy of destruction and who is not. For there are indeed many psukim, many verses that also say that we want the wicked to change, not just go, but to change and no longer be wicked and move away from what they are doing. And presumably our intent is that God will help this happen one way or the other. I will push back, however, and say that God does not tell us, and we do not tell God, that we're going to leave it just to God. And that time and time again we have been called to stand up against Pharaoh, to stand up against Antiochus of the Maccabee story, to stand up against the Nazis. And we don't simply say, God, please kill the Nazis. We also got on boats and traveled to Europe and overthrew the Nazi regime. So it is not purely a religious appeal, it is also a call to arms, even within Judaism. So while yes, we are much more reluctant to take the matters into our own hands, we certainly recognize that there are times when it must be our action, first and foremost, hopefully supported and strengthened by God's support, but still in our hands. So I will argue again that I don't think it is just the calls for destruction that disturb us, because we have those as well. Which means there has to be another difference in this. And I'd like to focus on one of those magic words that get thrown around where no one actually knows what it means, but it sounds good, and so we're going to use it anyway. One of the major chants and one of the major screeds that have come out of these protests is death or an end to Zionism. Zionism. It has become one of those words that is now laden with meaning beyond which the word itself can support. So for the protesters, for a moment, because it's always important to understand the position of those that we oppose, for the protesters, what does the word Zionism or Zionist mean? What do they mean when they are saying this word? Because this may be very different, I hope, than what we mean when we say that word, although I will warn you, we may not know what we mean when we say it either. They mean colonizers, right? When they say Zionists, they mean colonizers. A particular type of colonizer, however, Jewish colonizers, that Zionism, in their mind, is a ethno-nationalist, racist, usually, in most of their definitions, settler colonial enterprise that took people that were foreign to the land and brought them in, displacing and harming the native population. And that was what Zionism was trying to do. That was the goal, the purpose, the origin. It is born in this blood, and thus it is an illegitimate ideology, 100% done. This is why they feel that they can use the phrase Zionism as a stand-in for the word evil, as a stand-in for the word reprehensible, abomination, or terrorist in their mind. Because in their mind, Zionism is, from the moment of its inception until today, it's baked into Zionism the idea that the Jews are a superior race that are allowed to come in and displace a native population with their colonial antics and violence. And most of us, if that were the true situation, would probably be equally aghast at such behavior. After all, if someone was to come into the United States and tell people that they had to get out because it was ours now, most of us would probably be rather alarmed and consider this to be an illegitimate claim. Correct? Okay. So what's wrong with that definition of Zionism? Well, there's a lot that's wrong with that definition of Zionism, but let's take it apart piece by piece by piece. So let's start with the biggest error in this definition of Zionism. Zionism is not a colonial enterprise. This is where most of the protesters go completely wrong, and I can understand, when I try to be fair-minded, where they get the perception, but I also am at a loss for words that they are incapable of following a thought for more than 2 sentences to realize that that conception is a misconception. So where do they get the idea that it's colonialism? Well, in the 1800s, when Zionism began, there was a very, very small Jewish population in the territory that would eventually become the modern state of Israel. By the time 1948 came around, that population was now hundreds of thousands. Most of those people were not born within that territorial borders. They had immigrated from other parts of the world. At that particular time, pre-1948, the vast majority had come from the European areas, what we would now call Europe. So, just like Europeans went around to India, Australia, the United States, Central and South America, and planted people into those other places, so too goes the very simplistic and limited thinking, this must be colonialism as well. Because you have people who were from Europe now making up a huge portion of the population in a place they weren't born, and the local people don't like it. How could it not be anything but colonialism? Well, there's a couple of reasons why it's not colonialism. One of the primary reasons, of course, is that colonialism is marked by foreigners moving to a foreign land and then displacing the local population. Well, we are not foreigners to that land. We cannot be colonists any more than an American can be considered a colonist. We'll come back to this in more detail later, I think. I'm checking my time. But we can always continue with another conversation. Any more than somebody moving from St. Augustine to Orlando would generally not be considered a colonist of Orlando, because they are moving within the territory that is their homeland, that is their land. Now, the push comes back, but that's not true. These were European Jews. These were not local Jews, and thus they have no claim to the land. When we point out that they were only living in Europe for the last 1,500 years plus because of the various expulsions and problems that happened in the land of Israel under the conquering armies of first the Romans and then other subsequent empires, we are told that our claim to the land has expired. That, yes, that's ancient history, if they are willing to admit that we live there at all, and unfortunately some of the more extreme versions do not, but the vast majority of the well-meaning protesters, who are simply not thinking it through, they do admit that we lived there at one point, but they point out that we are not going to relitigate what the Romans did. We are not going to relitigate what the Persians did. We're not going to relitigate what the Arab empires did. We're not going to relitigate what the Ottoman Empire did. We are only going to relitigate what the United Nations did. And then we have to point out to them, are you being consistent in that application of logic about not relitigating past events? Because after all, you have just said that we should relitigate what happened in 1948, that we should relitigate what the United Nations decision was, that there should be a Jewish state in this territory. Well, if we're going to relitigate that, then you're saying that some historical events can be overturned. And if you were to ask them, at what point would the Palestinian claim to the land of Israel, the one that they believe supersedes ours, at what point would that claim expire? In 100 years, in 500 years, in 1,000 years? At which point would they no longer have a legitimate claim to the land? Most of them will answer that that would never occur, that the Palestinians now have a permanent, indefinite, and infinite claim to the land. But if their claim to the land will never expire, why did our claim to the land expire? We are not colonists. We are returning. They may not want us to return, and that's why there needs to be debate, discussion, and negotiation. But the fact that we are returning is not in and of itself illegitimate. It is not colonialism. It is not illegitimate prima facie from its inception. We can argue about the details, but to say that the Jews have no right to the land, you would have to equally say that under a certain amount of time, the Palestinians would have no right to the land. And I can assure you that the protesters are not going to agree to that equality of interpretation. The other idea, of course, is that this is an ethno-nationalist project, that there is something inherently wrong in the idea that somebody would want to have a country that has at its heart a particular ethnicity, a particular national identity. That Zionism is illegitimate because it is nationalistic. Well, first of all, usually the term nationalism is used when somebody would like to disagree with someone else's patriotism for something that they don't agree with. That is to say, if I support my country and you like my country, then I am a patriot. If I support my country and you don't like my country, then I am a nationalist. It's one of those irregular nouns that gets modified depending upon subjective opinions rather than actual reality. But more importantly, there is a point to their argument that we are seeing in Zionism an ethnic movement. And maybe it is time to define what is Zionism for us. Not the definition of the protesters, but what is actual Zionism for us? Or maybe we'll make it easier. What was Zionism when it was invented in the 1800s? Anybody got a definition for me? The right for Jews to have a homeland. Well, hold on. So there are different layers of Zionism, but the core essence of Zionism is that Jews deserve a land of their own. Now, this eventually settles, as the debate begins in the Jewish world in the 1800s, it eventually settles that that should be the historical homeland, and no substitute would be an appropriate alternative. Yeah, no random bits of territory in Argentina, Madagascar, whatever, but that it would be within the boundaries of the original Jewish homeland, meaning the state of Israel. Well, why is that a legitimate ideology? Why do we think that that makes sense? Well, first let's do a little history, and then we'll try and bring it into the modern world. So historically, this made perfect sense because it was all the rage. In the 1800s especially, but had begun throughout the period of the Enlightenment, there was a concept known as self-determination. That groups should be able to determine for themselves the fate of their own people. That if you are British, you should not be subjected to French rule over what should happen within your Emerald Islands. That's Ireland, sorry. And within the bejeweled, probably that might also be a bit of an issue about self-determination there, but within the beautiful British Isles, that the British should make those decisions. That the local people should be the ones in charge of those decisions. And this became an agitation that led to many conflicts across Europe in particular. World War I can very much be seen as a result of the agitation for self-determination among the people in particular of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After all, it was a Serbian terrorist that lit the match that fell on top of the powder keg that had been built up for World War I. And this concept of self-determination was quite well grounded within Enlightenment philosophy of freedom, of independence. Because there was a recognition that should a group be subject to a different group's authority, that chances were that their rights, their freedoms, their liberties would be infringed upon. It wasn't really a chance, it was pretty much a certainty, at least in history up till that point. There was a great deal of difficulty throughout Europe, and again, this was where Zionism was born, so it is the most relevant theater for discussion. There was a great deal of difficulty in Europe for the people in power to want to give full equality, full respect, and full dignity of humanity to the people that were not like them, but happened to live underneath their authority. So if you were in Spain, yes, you were in power, the Spanish ruled, and if you were Basque in Spain, you were not going to be given the same dignity and rights as the other more legitimate Spaniards in that country. Now, there was no greater example of a particular population that was usually at the short end of the stick when it came to freedoms and liberties than the Jews. We lived in most of the European countries at the point when Zionism was being founded, and even in countries where we had greatly assimilated, where we spoke the local language, where we behaved in the local ways, where we were members of the local society in every way that was allowed to us, there was still a great deal of resentment, of bitterness, discrimination, and persecution. And in those places that didn't give us that, we got pogroms. We had expulsions, and we had catastrophe after catastrophe that proved to us that being a minority within another country's domain was not a good place for us to be. And so Zionism was born out of that idea that if there is a persecuted minority, a minority that within the country where it currently inhabits, it cannot find its own dignity, freedom, and liberty, that it's probably a good idea to allow that group to set up their own shop. Now, throughout most of Europe, this has led to what is often affectionately called Balkanization, the idea that smaller ethnic groups should be allowed to fracture larger empires into local rule that has the commonality of culture, heritage, and history that will provide them with the stability and the willingness to extend rights and freedoms to each other within their own borders in a better measure. Well, that doesn't really work for the Jews, say the early Zionists. We can't just say, give us this chunk of Poland. We can't just say, give us this chunk of France, because first of all, we don't have a historical connection to that land as being independently our own at any point in history. And secondly, that may benefit the few Jews that live in that particular corner of the world, but that's not going to help all the other Jews that are in the rest of the world and in other countries. And so, Zionism struck out with the idea that we needed a place where we could, yes, have a cultural majority that would thus ensure the safety and freedom of the Jews that lived within the borders of this Jewish homeland. And for legitimacy's sake, there was really only one place on the planet that was the appropriate territory for this project to be built upon, the land of Israel. So, Zionism becomes the idea, fundamentally, that Jews are equal to the rest of the world. That if the French deserve their own country, if the Italians deserve their own country, if the Chinese deserve their own country, then the Jews deserve our own country. We've had our country before, it was taken away from us. We have lived among other nations, and they have been horrible to us. So, because of both history as well as personal and present need, the Jews too, just like the other countries and cultures of the world, deserved their own land. It's a fairly simple proposition. And it's one, like I said, that is built upon the definition of equality. If you say the Jews do not deserve their own country, if you say that Zionism is wrong, then you must also explain why any other country does deserve to exist. If Israel doesn't have a right to exist, then why does Kuwait? Why does Japan? Why does China? Why is Israel alone asked to defend its own right to exist, when other countries, which are often stitched together out of historical fiction, much more tangential than the history of us, why are they allowed to exist without question or comment? Well, because there is a problem. Going back to our protesters, many of them seem, some of them innocently, some of them very aggressively, to recognize that the Jews are different. And that is, of course, the kernel of anti-Semitism that is at the root of anti-Zionism. It's not, I can be opposed to Israel, but I am still okay with Jews. Because to be opposed to Zionism in its basic form is to say, I don't think the Jews, of all the peoples in the world who have an equal and legitimate claim, should actually get to press their claim. I don't think that of all the countries of the world that were created by the League of Nations and then ratified by the United Nations and recognized by nation after nation around the world, out of all of those countries, this is the one that should go away. Why? Because the Jews are different. Their claim is illegitimate when all the other claims are not. Their claim is suspect when all the other claims are not. They must prove their worth. All the others are taken with historical inertia as being inevitable. This is, at its heart, an anti-Semitic argument, and one that many of the protesters don't seem to be willing to recognize in their own right. To understand that to be opposed to Zionism is to say the Jews of all the nations of the world have no right to have a home. It is a hard position to justify. And we have seen many of them go to great lengths to try and soften the statement. No, we just want there to be freedom and we just don't want there to be ethno-nationalism and yada, yada, yada. But we have also seen, quite thankfully, in my opinion, over the last few months, more and more voices willing to say the quiet part out loud. To say, no, you're right. We do think the Jews are different. We do think that Zionists should die. That we are willing to chant death to the Zionists, death to the settler colonialists, even when we would never utter such a word against any other country on this planet. And why? Well, because they're Jews. And as such, they are different and not protected by the normal bounds of international fraternity or even basic human dignity. Recognize that this is the underlying crisis. As much as I weep to see people being dragged out of buildings or through encampments, as much as I hate the idea of protests being shut down, when the protest is built upon the fundamental statement that these people, our people, lack the basic humanity that should give them at least the benefit of doubt that we can enter into negotiations and discussions, well, then that is a violent protest, whether it has lifted a rifle yet or not. It is calling for the wholesale destruction, not of a particular state, but of a people. And that is a problem. That is not merely exercising one's right to gather and protest, or merely exercising one's right to free speech. That is a call of imminent violence and threat against others, and dehumanizing from its inception. So I am glad that many of the colleges have taken steps to stop that type of protesting. If somebody wishes to protest in favor of peace, that they wish truly for all people within those borders that we would call Israel to live in peace, I will probably disagree with many of their ideas of how that can be achieved, but I would absolutely support their right to have that protest, to make that claim. By all means, join with me in hoping that there will be peace for the millions of people who live within these territories. But as soon as you say Zionism is illegitimate, as soon as you say death to the Zionists have no right to life, recognize that you are merely smearing a veneer of acceptability over a fundamentally hateful and dehumanizing principle. Because you are saying that of all the nations of the world, the Jews don't deserve it. Now, there is a corollary which I will leave you with to think about, because I never want to let anyone go away feeling completely happy with everything that I've said, because then you're not thinking, which is, the basic proposition is, the Jews are like other nations, and thus we deserve our own homeland. If we believe that in principle, that is the underlying message of Zionism. Indeed, it is how it was born and how it was brought through fruition and how it was argued before the nations of the world. Then we must also ask, who else deserves a homeland? Shabbat Shalom.